A poor black boy rescues a millionaire's son. The gift he receives leaves him in tears. Marcus trekked home, his school bag heavy on his back. The sun was setting behind the row of run-down buildings, casting long shadows over the narrow streets of his neighborhood. He was used to this: the broken sidewalks, the peeling paint on crumbling houses, and the distant sound of sirens echoing in the background. It was all he'd ever known. His sneakers kicked up small clouds of dust as he walked, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the homework he had yet to finish and the grocery list his mother had given him for the evening. Suddenly, something caught his attention. A van pulled up to the curb a few feet ahead, its tires screeching slightly as it came to a halt. Marcus slowed his pace, eyes narrowing. There was nothing unusual about vans in this part of town, but something about this one felt off. The way it came to a stop seemed too sudden and deliberate. And then he saw it. The side door slid open, and two men in dark clothing rushed out, their faces hidden by black caps. His heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively ducked behind a nearby dumpster, watching with wide eyes. In the next instant, a small boy, no older than 8, appeared on the sidewalk. He had been walking just ahead, unaware of the danger until it was too late. The men grabbed him quickly, one covering his mouth to stifle his screams while the other shoved him into the van. The entire scene unfolded in seconds, and before Marcus could even process what was happening, the van's engine roared to life. But something inside Marcus refused to let this happen. Maybe it was the thought of his younger siblings at home, or maybe it was just pure instinct, but he couldn't stand by and watch. Without a second thought, Marcus jumped out of his hiding spot, running toward the van as it started to pull away. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He wasn't even sure it would work, but he had to try something. His feet pounded against the pavement as he ran, and just as the van sped up, Marcus leaped forward, grabbing the handle of the rear door and yanking it open. The door swung wide, and for a brief moment, Marcus found himself staring into the dark interior of the van, where the boy sat trembling in fear, his eyes wide with terror. The men shouted angrily, but Marcus didn't give them time to react. He reached in, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him out of the van with all his strength. The van swerved, the driver trying to shake them off, but Marcus clung to the boy, refusing to let go. As soon as they hit the ground, he rolled, shielding the child with his body as they tumbled across the pavement. His head smacked the concrete, sending a sharp pain through his skull, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Run!" Marcus gasped, pushing the boy toward an alleyway. "Go! Go now!" The boy hesitated for a second, still frozen with fear, but then his legs started moving. He sprinted down the alley, disappearing into the shadows just as the van screeched to a halt a few feet away. One of the men jumped out, his face filled with rage. Marcus rose to his feet, his pulse racing. He wasn't fast enough. The man ran towards him with his fist connecting with Marcus's jaw. Pain exploded in his face as he staggered backward, but he didn't fall. He stood his ground, determined to buy the boy more time to get away. The second man was getting out of the van now, his face just as furious as his partner's. Marcus's vision blurred for a moment, the adrenaline surging through his veins, barely keeping him upright. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The men advanced, their expressions dark and menacing. Marcus had no idea what they wanted with the boy, but he knew it couldn't be good. He had to hold them off just for a little longer. He dodged another punch, his body reacting more out of instinct than thought. The first man swung wildly, and Marcus ducked just in time, his heart hammering in his chest. He was no match for them, and he knew that. But he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when that boy's life was on the line. But just as the second man moved in to join the fight, the distant sound of a police siren cut through the air. The men froze for a split second, their eyes looking toward the sound. Marcus's chest swollen as he took in shallow breaths, his entire body aching from the blows he'd already taken. The siren grew louder, closer, and for the first time since the fight had started, Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. "Let's go," one of them whispered, his voice low and urgent. Without another word, they turned and ran back to the van. The tires squealed as the vehicle sped off into the distance, disappearing around the corner. Marcus stood there, his fists clenched, watching them go. His vision swam, and he stumbled, catching himself on a nearby wall to keep from collapsing. Moments later, the police arrived, their flashing lights casting a low glow over the alley. Marcus barely felt their presence as they rushed toward him, asking questions he couldn't answer. His head throbbed, his jaw ached, and his entire body felt like it had been through a war. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that the boy had gotten away. He was safe. As the paramedics checked Marcus for injuries, a small voice broke through the chaos. "Thank you." Marcus looked up to see the boy standing at the edge of the alley, his face pale, but his eyes full of gratitude. Marcus managed a weak smile, nodding in acknowledgement. He didn't need thanks. He was just glad the boy was alive. Little did Marcus know, this act of bravery would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. 2 days after the rescue, Marcus sat at the small kitchen table in his cramped apartment, quietly eating a bowl of cereal. His mother had already left for her second job, and his 2 younger siblings were still asleep in the next room. The events from that night replayed in his mind over and over again. The van, the men, the boy he saved. The bruise on his jaw acted as a reminder of how close he'd come to getting seriously hurt. He tried not to dwell on it, focusing instead on getting through the day ahead. Life had always been hard, but it was even harder now that his mother was juggling 2 jobs, and Marcus had to shoulder more responsibility at home. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Marcus frowned, not expecting anyone. He wasn't sure if it was a neighbor or someone else, but as soon as he opened the door, his confusion turned into shock. Standing in the hallway was a man in a dark suit, flanked by 2 others who looked like security guards. The man's polished appearance stood out in contrast to the peeling wallpaper and shabby floors of Marcus's apartment building. Marcus froze, unsure of what to say. "Are you Marcus?" the man asked, his tone firm but not unfriendly. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes darting between the men. He had no idea what they wanted, but his gut told him it had something to do with what happened in the alley. "I'm Thomas Stevenson," the man said, extending his hand. "The boy you saved, Ethan Stevenson. He's my son." Marcus stared at the man's hand for a moment before shaking it, still too stunned to speak. "May I come in?" Stevenson asked. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority in it that made Marcus step aside without hesitation. As Stevenson walked in, Marcus felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He'd never had anyone like this in his home. Marcus took them to the small living room, where a few mismatched chairs sat around an old TV. He hoped his siblings wouldn't wake up and see the strangers in their home. Stevenson sat down, his gaze sweeping over the modest surroundings. He seemed out of place here, but Marcus couldn't help but notice the way his expression softened, as though he was trying to understand what life was like in this part of town. After a brief moment of silence, Stevenson looked directly at Marcus. "I came here to thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "You saved my son's life. I don't even want to imagine what could have happened if you hadn't been there." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't do it for recognition. He hadn't even expected to see the boy again, let alone have his father show up at his door. "Ethan told me everything," Stevenson continued, "about how you pulled him out of the van and protected him until he could run. That was an incredibly brave thing to do, Marcus." Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment. He didn't feel brave, just lucky that he hadn't been seriously hurt. He glanced down at his hands, unsure of how to respond. I just did what anyone would do," Marcus whispered. Stevenson shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "Not everyone would have done what you did. Most people would have been too scared to get involved. You risked your life for my son, and I won't forget that." There was a long pause, and then Stevenson reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. He placed it on the table between them, sliding it toward Marcus. "I know you didn't do this for money," Stevenson said, his eyes steady. "But I want to give you something to show my gratitude. It's the least I can do." Marcus stared at the envelope, his stomach twisting into knots. He didn't want a reward. He hadn't saved the boy for any kind of compensation, and the thought of accepting money for it felt wrong. His mother had always taught him that helping others was its own reward, and he didn't want to ruin that by taking money. But at the same time, he knew how badly his family needed it. His mother was working herself to the bone just to keep a roof over their heads, and even then they were still living a harsh life. "I appreciate it, sir," Marcus said slowly, his voice thick with uncertainty. "But I can't take this." He pushed the envelope back toward Stevenson, who raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Are you sure?" Stevenson asked, his tone genuine. "It's not just money. There's something in there that could really help you." Marcus hesitated, his eyes flicking back to the envelope. For a moment, he considered taking it, if not for himself, then for his family. But something inside him resisted. He didn't want to feel like he owed anyone anything, and taking this would make him feel like he was indebted to a man he barely knew. "I'm sure," Marcus said firmly, standing his ground. Stevenson's expression shifted, a mixture of respect and curiosity. He hadn't expected this response, especially not from a boy who clearly had so little. Stevenson stood up, tucking the envelope back into his jacket. "All right," he said, his tone respectful. "I respect your decision, Marcus, but if you ever change your mind, the offer stands." He handed Marcus a business card, his name and contact information printed on expensive paper. Marcus took the card, unsure if he would ever use it. As Stevenson and his guards left the apartment, Marcus stood in the doorway, watching them walk down the hallway. He still felt unsettled, unsure of whether he had made the right choice. The idea of accepting help from someone as wealthy and powerful as Stevenson felt foreign to him. But deep down, he also knew that his family needed something more than money. They needed hope, a real way out of the cycle of poverty they were trapped in. As he closed the door, Marcus slipped the business card into his pocket, knowing that the encounter with Mr. Stevenson was far from over. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed while staring at the small business card Mr. Stevenson had left behind, running his thumb over the embossed letters. It had been days since the visit, and Marcus still wasn't sure how to feel about it. A part of him regretted not taking the envelope. He could only guess how much money had been inside, and it could have solved a lot of their problems. But then again, he wasn't the kind of person to take handouts. His mother had raised him to be strong, to work for what he had no matter how hard life got. Life had been getting harder, though. Marcus's family was barely holding on. His mother worked 2 exhausting jobs, one as a cleaner at a hotel and the other as a cashier at a local grocery store. She was gone from early morning until late at night, and the wear and tear of working long hours in physically demanding roles was starting to show. Her once bright smile was now tired and faint, and the lines on her face deepened with each passing day. Marcus tried to help where he could, taking care of his younger brother and sister, but the strain of being both a brother and a stand-in parent was taking its toll on him too. He was only 14, but Marcus already felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Every day after school, he rushed home to make dinner for his siblings, helped them with their homework, and got them ready for bed. Some nights, after everyone else had fallen asleep, he stayed up worrying about things no 14-year-old should have to think about: rent, bills, food. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer they could keep going like this. His mind often drifted back to that moment in the alley, to the boy he'd saved. The fear in the boy's eyes had haunted Marcus for days, but now it wasn't fear that filled his thoughts. It was the opportunity. What if that moment had been the turning point? What if he'd missed his chance to change things for his family by turning down Mr. Stevenson's offer? One evening, after helping his siblings with their homework, Marcus overheard his mother on the phone. She was speaking in hushed tones, but the worry in her voice was unmistakable. I know, but I just need more time," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I promise I'll have the money by the end of the month." Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation to understand. They were behind on rent again. It wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But each time it happened, it felt like the walls of their small apartment were closing in just a little more. After she hung up, his mother sat down at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. Marcus hated seeing her like this. She was always so strong, always so determined to shield them from the harsh realities of life, but Marcus could see through the cracks in her armor. He wanted to help. He wanted to do more than just make sure his siblings got their homework done and dinner was on the table. He wanted to take some of the burden off his mother's shoulders. But how? They had so little, and the world around them seemed so unforgiving. Later that night, Marcus pulled out the business card again. He turned it over in his hand, his fingers brushing against the smooth paper. He didn't want charity, but maybe, just maybe, Mr. Stevenson could offer something more. Maybe he could help in a way that didn't make Marcus feel like he was taking a handout. There was only one way to find out. The next morning, Marcus made up his mind. He tucked the business card into his pocket before heading to school. Throughout the day, he kept thinking about what he would say if he called Mr. Stevenson. He didn't want to come across as desperate, but he also didn't want to pass up an opportunity that could change their lives. By the time school let out, his nerves were getting the better of him. His palms were sweaty as he pulled out his phone and dialed the number. "Hello?" a voice answered on the other end. "Mr. Stevenson?" Marcus's voice trembled slightly. "This is Marcus, the boy who, saved your son." There was a brief pause before Mr. Stevenson replied, his voice warm and welcoming. "Marcus, I've been hoping you'd call. How are you?" Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm all right," he said, though it wasn't entirely true. "I wanted to talk to you about what you offered the other day," he said slowly. Mr. Stevenson didn't hesitate. "Of course, Marcus. Why don't you come by my office tomorrow? We can talk in person. I'll send a car to pick you up." Marcus agreed, and the next day, a nice black car arrived outside his apartment building. As he rode through the city, Marcus's mind raced. He wasn't sure what he was going to ask for, or how the conversation would go, but he knew this was a chance he couldn't pass up. When Marcus arrived at Mr. Stevenson's office, he was greeted by the same man who had visited his apartment. Mr. Stevenson smiled as he welcomed Marcus into his large office. The difference between their worlds was very obvious. The walls were lined with expensive paintings, and the floor-to-ceiling windows showed the busy city below. Marcus felt small, almost out of place, but he reminded himself why he was there. They sat down, and after a few pleasantries, Mr. Stevenson leaned forward, his eyes kind but serious. "So, Marcus," he said, "what can I do for you?" For a moment, Marcus wasn't sure how to begin, but then the words started pouring out. He told Mr. Stevenson about his family, about his mother working 2 jobs, about the struggle to pay rent, and about how hard it was to take care of his siblings while still trying to keep up with school. He didn't ask for money. Instead, he asked for something bigger, something that could change their lives for good. "I don't want a handout," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I just want a chance. A real chance to make things better for my family." Mr. Stevenson listened carefully, nodding as Marcus spoke. When Marcus finished, there was a long pause. Then, with a thoughtful expression, Mr. Stevenson leaned back in his chair. "You're not asking for much, Marcus," he said, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I think we can work something out." A few days passed after Marcus's meeting with Mr. Stevenson. Every morning he woke up with a nervous excitement coursing through his veins, uncertain of what to expect next. He had poured his heart out to the millionaire, laying bare the struggles of his family and his desire to make things better for them. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he had a gut feeling that something significant was about to happen. It was a Thursday afternoon when Marcus got the call. He had just finished walking his siblings home from school when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something told him to pick up. "Hello?" Marcus answered, his voice tentative. "Marcus, it's Thomas Stevenson," came the familiar voice on the other end. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I wanted to let you know that I've come to a decision. I'd like to meet with you and your mother tomorrow if that works." Marcus's heart leapt in his chest. "Yes, that works," he stammered, barely able to contain his excitement. "I'll tell her. Thank you, Mr. Stevenson." The next day, Marcus found himself sitting in the back of another sleek car, his mother beside him, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. He hadn't told her everything about his conversation with Mr. Stevenson, only that a man wanted to help them. She was skeptical, as any mother would be, but Marcus could tell that deep down, she was hopeful too. They pulled up to the large office building where Marcus had met Mr. Stevenson the first time. As they walked through the glass doors, Marcus's mother gripped his hand tightly. She was nervous, but Marcus felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He knew that whatever was about to happen, it was going to be good. Mr. Stevenson greeted them in the lobby, his smile warm and genuine. He led them up to his office, where they sat down together at a large mahogany table. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mr. Stevenson cleared his throat and looked directly at Marcus's mother. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, "I want to start by thanking you. Your son is an extraordinary young man. He did something truly heroic, and I can see that he's been raised with strength and values. That speaks to you, and I respect that deeply." Marcus's mother blinked, taken unaware by the compliment. She hadn't expected this man, a millionaire with so much power, to speak to her with such kindness and respect. Mr. Stevenson continued, "When Marcus saved my son, he wasn't just saving a child, he was showing me something important. He reminded me that there are people out there like him who are struggling, not because they lack talent or drive, but because they haven't been given the opportunities they deserve. And I want to help change that, starting with your family." Marcus's mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Stevenson," she said cautiously, "but we don't take charity. We work for what we have, even if it isn't much." Mr. Stevenson nodded. "I understand completely," he replied. "I'm not here to offer charity. I'm here to offer a chance, an opportunity. Marcus told me about your situation, about how hard you're working to provide for your children. That kind of dedication deserves support, not handouts. So, here's what I'd like to do." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "First, I'd like to offer Marcus a full scholarship to one of the best private schools in the city. He's a bright young man with a lot of potential, and I want to make sure he gets the education he deserves. It'll cover everything: tuition, books, uniforms, whatever he needs. And beyond that, I want to create a savings account for him, so that when he's ready to go to college, he won't have to worry about the cost." Marcus felt his heart stop for a moment. A full scholarship? He had dreamed of going to a good school, but it had always seemed so far out of reach. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Mr. Stevenson wasn't finished. "Second, I know you're struggling to keep up with rent and bills," he said, turning to Marcus's mother. "So I've arranged for you to be placed in a new job, one with better pay, fewer hours, and more stability. It's at a company I own, and you'll have the chance to move up if you want to. I want to make sure that you don't have to work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on." Marcus's mother's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She had been fighting for so long, working herself to the bone, and here was someone offering her the chance to breathe again. To live, not just survive. Mr. Stevenson smiled gently. "I'm not offering this because I feel sorry for you," he said softly. "I'm offering this because I believe in people like you and Marcus, people who deserve better but just haven't been given the opportunity. This is your chance to take control of your future, and I want you to know that I'm here to support you every step of the way." Marcus's mother wiped her eyes, her voice shaky as she spoke. "I don't know what to say, Mr. Stevenson. This is more than I could have ever imagined. Thank you. Truly." Marcus sat quietly, his mind racing. He had dreamed of something like this, a way out for his family, a way to give his mother the rest she deserved. But now that it was actually happening, he couldn't stop the tears from filling up in his eyes. He had tried so hard to be strong, to take care of his family on his own, but now he realized that it was okay to accept help when it was given with kindness and respect. As they left Mr. Stevenson's office that day, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long was starting to lift, and for the first time he could see a future filled with possibility. It wasn't just about money or material things, it was about the chance to build a better life, a life where they didn't have to struggle every single day. And that gift, more than anything, left Marcus in tears. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing inspiring stories like this one. We have many more powerful stories of resilience, family, and hope waiting for you. Click on the links on your screen to explore more heartwarming tales. Thank you for being part of our community, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.